Okay, as I am instructed to give you some sort of tutorial for your entertainment by Lacey on how making scrimshaw horns. Here is a horn, obviously done up, ready to finish. First thing we're going to do is take some fine steel wool after we've scraped and sanded and everything down. If you want to make it and get all the little scratches out of it as we can. Those little scratches are what's going to hold the ink in and cloud it up and so forth. This takes a while, but we don't need to sit here and do that for an hour for you. Okay, next step is we have our tools here. The obvious first thing is the pencil. Now some people take, and I've read, I haven't tried this, but they'll print off pictures like off a printer and then use acetate, wet them, and they can stick them to the horn and then use that as their outline. I haven't tried that because I have fairly good skills at the freehand drawing, so I usually just use that to block it in with the pencil. But whatever works for you is the thing to do. Anyway, proportion is everything, so of course you want to do all your writing with your pencil before you get to actually scratching. Let's see if I can find my other tools here. Like I say, it's just a number tool pencil. Okay, when you actually get to scratching, some people traditionally they used India ink, and I've used India ink and it works, but I haven't found that it works any better than Sharpie ink. The difference is, like when you scratch and then you fill in with the India ink splatters everywhere and you end up with more of a mess, whereas the Sharpie ink, you can just go over the scratches, and we'll get to that later. And that's going to allow you to be able to just hit your lines without making a mess everywhere, and it's just less cleanup and it still lasts just as long. But it just depends on whether you want to go real traditional or not. It's up to you. I want to show you a little bit about scribes, because this is where a lot of people actually get off on the wrong foot to start with. Okay? Some folks will use a Dremel tool, which never use a Dremel tool. It's just too big. Okay, the next thing is, after that, they try and scratch it in using something too large. Say like a nail, like something like this. This is going to make far too big of a line. It tears too much of the horn fiber, and it's just too rough. You can't get fine detail with this. Okay, so a good alternative, a much better alternative, is to take something like a needle, a dental pick, something like that, something hard. It has to be something hard. And then, can you see that good? Mm-hmm. Okay. And then grind it down to a nice fine point. The finer the point, the better, and which is why you want it to be a real high carbon hard material. The harder the better, because otherwise you're going to dull your point while you're using it. And then you could just drill a little hole and stick that into a little dowel or something to that effect. I like to put a little tape on it to build it up to where it fits. Because different people have different size of hands, and some people will be comfortable with a little one. Some people want a nice big fat one. I find that there's less strain in my hand if I'm not having to squeeze something smaller than what naturally fits. Now, excuse me. The one that I prefer is, this is a special Carbide Scribe, if you can see the point on it or not real good. It has a very fine point. There's also, you can get them in a larger point for larger lines and that. The nice thing about these is that they're carbide, so they don't hardly ever dull, so you're not sharpening them all the time. And because they're made for this, and they're done on a machine and ground down to a nice conical point, you don't have the flat spots that you usually get when you're doing it yourself and you're trying to sharpen it up, and you get a flat spot. And what happens there is, like, you're trying to pull a line and you hit the flat spot, and it tries to follow the flat spots, because there's a grain structure to the horn. Because basically what horn is horn is, you know, like your fingernails, your hair. It's like hair fibers that are held together with a collagen-based glue that your body produces, basically. And so there's a grain structure that goes down the long axis of it. And so your scratches, your scribe wants to follow the grain structure. And so when you have flat spots in your scribe, they tend to catch and try and follow that, and it makes it hard. You want to be able to do circles, for example. If you can do circles without it catching and stuff, you've got it pretty sharp. Or you can test it kind of on your fingernail to see if it grabs without applying pressure. So you don't want to apply a lot of pressure for a couple reasons. One reason is because if you apply a whole lot of pressure, then you tend to lose your finer motor skills with your fingers, you know, kind of like versus, you know. And when it comes to something like painting, drawing, and that scrimshawing, engraving, you know, it's mostly all in the small joints and small muscles here, not in your arm, like although, you know, if you're on larger stuff, if you're blocking in, a lot of people say that you actually register in with a different part of your brain when you're using your arm motions and stuff like that. I don't know, but for this type of work, you're not doing arm motions anyway. So the other reason you don't want to push really hard is because especially in the beginning, you're going to make a lot of mistakes, and if you have light lines, you can always go over your light lines. And as a general rule, it's best to build up using cross hatching or hatching, very much like pen and ink. It's a good idea to study a lot of old engravings and stuff. But so you can build up your depth that way, as opposed to trying to get darker lines by digging in deeper. But because if they're not really dug in deep and you make a mistake, you can simply, you know, scrape them off down a little bit, and you can basically erase stuff that way. But if you got them real deep, then you're scraping more. And let's say you got a picture started there and you're doing good, but you want to erase one section. Well, if it's shallow, you know, you can scrape away that spot. Where if it's deep, you end up scraping most of the picture away and stuff like that. Anyway, so that's a start for the tools. And until we get a little bit farther along here, then I'll show you kind of how we block it in. That's just dependent on your skills at drawing. If you can draw pretty good, then you can freehand pencil. If not, you might want to tape on a picture, you know, print off and transfer it down there, something like that. Okay, so here we have kind of some of the blocking in, is what I call it. Blocking in is basically where you get your proportions proper. It doesn't generally include much for the three-dimensional, because if you study, you know, art as it is, you know that the study of light is the study of depth. So, but mostly what we're wanting to do when we block in is get proportions and set everything, because otherwise what happens is you end up starting in on, let me shut off Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, okay. You get carried away in little details, and then you build on it, and when you get to the end of whatever you're working on, then it doesn't all fit, because you get carried away with one thing, and also you get your mind wrapped up in the depth of something, that you kind of lose track of keeping everything sized right. So what we do is we kind of make a rough idea of where things are going to be. So, you know, we're going to have a ship kind of over here, and this is going to be the whalers, and you're going to have a whale here, and obviously I didn't put in waves here because, you know, that's fun little details that you can do later. One of the things that when you're blocking in with your graphite is that a lot of times it's not a good idea to draw the entire thing out and then go to scratching it all in, because you're going to be holding your horn in different ways to keep it steady while you're engraving. and what inadvertently happens is you end up smudging your picture. So it really doesn't pay to do a whole lot of detail on something you're going to be putting your hand over. So, like in this case, if you notice, I've got more detail in this section and just kind of arrangement here, so I got it placed right. And so I'll do the engraving of like this section for the most part to its finality before I move on to another section. And as long as you do it that way, you don't have a lot of time wrapped up in doing the whale and doing the ship and then smudging it and then having to do it over again. And that saves you a lot of time. Otherwise you're drawing and you're drawing and drawing, and you really want to be engraving, not just drawing over and over. And the thing to remember is also, if you drew it once, you can draw it again. So if you smudge it, draw it again. You know, and it actually gets easier every other time you do it because of the fact that it's kind of like a muscle memory thing. Once you put a whale here, you tend to retrace that same thing over again because that's what you did last time. You see it differently. But anyway, that's why we kind of work in small sections when we do it, so that we don't have to draw over and over and over. You're already going to have to draw over and over and over, and you're going to have to engrave. It's kind of like, it's kind of like pen and ink. You have your blocking in stage, and then you have your 3D stage, and then you have your ink stage, and so most pictures you end up drawing 3 or 4 times whenever you're working on it, and it's kind of that way with this. You'll draw, you'll scratch, you'll draw, you'll scratch, you'll scratch, you'll draw, and it ends up taking a whole lot longer than most people think. Most people think of drawing as like, oh, I'm done. Yeah, it's nothing to have 10 hours wrapped up in a simple drawing. It's really not. But anyway, so I'm going to start engraving on this little section here, and then when I get a little farther along, we'll kind of show you the next step of it. Okay, so here we have kind of some of the basic outline and basic shadow, starter shadows done in here. When you're working on white horn, seeing, you can scratch over the graphite, but actually seeing the depth of your hatching and so forth can get pretty difficult. So, and there's a few different ways that you can deal with that. Sometimes you might just blacken an area and then work in that. It's kind of like working in a negative, if you've ever tried that. And it works good. The only downside is when you go to, unless you have your horn perfectly polished smooth, you often get the ink in the existing cracks, and it ends up looking kind of cloudy when you try and take it off. Another avenue is to take and buff it with beeswax, and that works pretty good. The only problem that I've found with that is that once you have buffed in, basically what you're doing is you're impregnating the cracks and sealing it with the beeswax, and then when you scratch, you're scratching through the beeswax into the horn, and when you ink it, it goes into that, and the rest of the ink stays on the outside and rubs off. So it works good, except that it makes such a smooth surface that your pencil doesn't want to write on the surface of the beeswax, essentially. So what I have come to using is where I kind of scratch in my basic outline, and then I tend to take my marker, especially a little one, and I kind of fill in on the outline, and as you can see here, and then it makes it all black. Now you're going to take that off, but that allows you to see, again, working in negative when you start trying to make it three-dimensional, because you can see your hatches, where otherwise you're kind of like and you can't really see what's going on. And the beauty of it is that even though I haven't sealed it, and even though I'm not perfectly smooth, which is kind of hard to do, I find, on horn, because of fibrous nature anyway, it tends to not want to polish up like ivory. Now, like ivory, you can be perfectly smooth. There's no, it's so compressed. There's no holes or pits or fibers in. But horn, some horn, depending on how dry it is, even after you're polishing and stuff, it still keeps hairlines in it. Now, by filling in just the areas that you're of subject. And it also kind of depends on the type of picture. But after you do your scratches and re-ink and then you take it off, the cloudiness can sometimes actually work in your favor, because since you don't have the cloudiness on the outside of your subject, but on the inside of your subject, let's say you're working with a white background and the inside of your subject is darker than the white, even in the highlights, it just kind of gives it a lot of times more mass, and so that cloudiness, as long as it's not on the outside of the picture but on the inside of the picture, it just gives it a little more body. Sometimes there's 100, different possible techniques you can use, but that's one that seems to work pretty good. And it's kind of like an ink wash. If you've ever seen how the ink wash, they draw their picture in ink and then they'll sometimes wash it over with a diluted ink with a brush. A lot of Chinese pictures used to be done that way. Interesting area of study if you ever get into it. But anyway, that's one way, and so that's the next step. Okay, having done some line work on the boat and the little dudes, and then ink those in, I'm going to take my steel wool after my ink to dry a bit and see where we're at, see where I've got to, see what I got to add. Or whether there's enough to move on to the next place. Obviously you'll see why I favor the permanent marker things. You have more control over where you put the ink rather than splashing all over the place. For those who don't know what is going on here, you're scratching, and then the ink stays in the depths of the scratches, and then when you wipe it off, you wipe off the surface ink, and the ink in the scratches stays down there. And let's see, there you have our. And there you have the ship and the little whalers. Now, one of the things that tends to be, did you get it? Mm-hmm. Okay. One of the things that tends to be difficult, particularly for people who are detail-oriented, when it comes to engraving and pen and ink work, as opposed to, say, oil painting or graphite work, because drawing, graphite is a pencil drawing. Now, going off on a flight of fancy, when we're talking about graphite drawing, which is why I don't say those who draw with pencil, because generally speaking, people who say, you draw with pencil, they're using number 2 pencil and one color or one shade, and some of them don't realize how many different shades of pencil there are when you get into it. But there is, like if you're doing photo quality stuff, you can spend hours and hours and hours and hours working on fine details and fine shading and highlights and so forth, and get immaculately realistic stuff. And as in all things, the larger the picture that you're doing, the more detail you can get in. When you move into the realm of pen and ink and engraving, the monster you're fighting against is you're not drawing so much a photocopy, because you only have so many lines. You're working with lines. You have only so many lines you can work with, and then you scratch it all up. And the smaller the picture that you're working on, just like the farther away, the more it's an indication you're trying to imply something. So, like something like this, you're working in small picture anyway. A lot of people don't realize that when you see like a print, normally that comes from a very large picture, and then when they take it to the printing place and they condense it down, the details actually get better as it gets smaller, because it started big and then it comes small. It's kind of like looking at a pixelated picture from a distance. It looks like a picture, and the closer you get to it, it just looks like a bunch of little squares. Kind of the same thing applies doing dots and dashes and so on and so forth. But so like if you were to go way up, you can see the scratches, and it looks good. And the farther back you go, then it starts to look more like detail. What you're doing is you're indicating a picture, and you're letting your mind do the rest. Why that's an important concept to realize is that you're trying to indicate that there's a boat and indicate that there is a person with enough detail to accomplish that, but while also accepting that you're not going to actually accomplish it. It's going to look like a person, but it's not going to take all of you can't get all of the details in that size. And you're working in such small pictures here that is particularly something that you have to bear in mind, is you're limited because it's only this big. If you were working on something this big with the same thing, you'd get more detail. So you want to try and be three-dimensional, unless of course symbolic is what you're going for. A lot of the traditional horns were not. They weren't depth pictures. They didn't have any three-dimensional value to them. They were largely symbolic, done with a large tool, not like a small tool. They're usually done with like a knife, like a jackknife. And some people still do it that way, and some people like them that way because they are more traditional. Other people like the more finer tipped inscribing. It's all a matter of preference. But anyway, nonetheless, even if you're trying to go for something that looks three-dimensional, it's still only an indication, an implied picture. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to learn to imply the most with the least. Not because of the fact that you don't want to, that you're trying to control your time. I mean, sometimes it might be, it depends, but mostly you're trying to control what material you have available to you, and you can only accomplish so much with so many lines in that size. Because when you start stacking too many lines, then it just looks all scratched up, and you lose more than you gain. A good example of what I'm talking about is if you ever, like pen and ink, you can get very, very detail oriented with pen and ink. But if you were to try and say do a picture with a large marker, you'll understand what I mean about minimizing lines, because your marker is this big and you only have so many strokes before everything turns black. Well, this is very much like that, because you're actually using fairly large strokes. Even though you're using as small a tool as you can get away with, you're using pretty large strokes for the picture. And as such, you just got to bear in mind that you're indicating and trying to learn to do that. And now we are working on the whale. Okay, now this here is mostly something we call stippling. It's where, as opposed to like here, it's called hatching, where you have the lines that follow the curvature of whatever the shape that you're trying to show there, so that it suggests a shape. And this here is where you put a little bunch of little bitty dots on here, and you build them up to suggest a shape too. And here, if you look close, you can see what I mean about darkening an area, because I'm kind of going over it from back and forth until I get it where I want it. But you notice here how it's inked in, and if you can see how you're working in negative. That explains what I was talking about.
Well, our ship is ready to bear away. Come, comrades, over the stormy sea. Her snow-white wings, they are unfurled, and soon she'll swim in a watery world. And do not forget, love, do not grieve. The heart is true and can't deceive. My heart and hand with you I'll leave. Farewell, my precious pearl. It's my lovely dark-haired, blue-eyed girl. And when I'm on the stormy sea, when you think of Ireland, remember me. Farewell to Dublin's halls and drays, to Killarney's lakes and silvery seas. 'Twas many the bright long summer's day when we passed those hours of joy away. Do not forget, love. Do not grieve.
And there you have it. All finished. Bunch of little scratches with a little bit of ink. Woohoo! Scrimshaw means waste of time. That's what the word means. Go figure.
Come, comrades, over the stormy sea.